All right. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Hopefully folks are starting to filter into our virtual room here. Let everyone get settled. So excited to have this conversation and so excited for you all to join us. Thank you for spending your time with us for the 5th installment of PYXERA Global's Rhetoric to Action series. For those of you who have been joining us since the beginning, you know that our conversations aim to really inspire the development of informed and intentional partnerships, programs, initiatives, simply stated actions that lead to solutions toward dismantling structural racism. And one of the things that I enjoy most about these conversations is that we bring diverse perspectives to the table. We have conversations with leaders from the social sector representing community interests and voices that are often overlooked. We've had conversations from the private sector, leaders from corporations from around the globe who reminded us that issues of race are not just US issues, that they in fact are truly global issues. And then we've even had a joint conversation with one of our corporate partners and one of their nonprofit partners or social sector partners who was a historically Black college. And they talked about the evolution of their relationship. They talked about what worked, what hasn't worked. They talked about some of the lessons that they've learned along the way. But they really showed us what partnership looks like and what the action piece of working toward dismantling injustices looks like for them. And so you are able to view those recordings on our website, on our PYXERA Global /Rhetoric to Action website. I invite you to please take a look at those. I think you should be able to see them in the chat if you were not able to join us back then. So the conversation today is no different. I am excited. We are excited to have the conversation around international development. We'll be hearing from 2 leaders, and you can see on the screen here, 2 leaders who have decades worth of experience between them and among them in the international development space. And so today we're going to talk specifically about racism from the historical, the political, and the social context, and how we as individuals can play a role in really moving the needle and kind of dismantling or changing the structure of these systems that truly have racism embedded in them. Now, before I get started and kind of introduce our speakers, many of us know that there's no shortage of criticism for the international development space. So we're not here to further that criticism. We are not here to kind of beat our peers and colleagues down. We're really here to learn. We're really here to share perspectives, experiences, all with, again, the intention on changing beliefs, shifting frames, shifting perspectives, and really looking to do things differently. But it's important that in order to do that, we understand the legacy, the underpinnings of the space that we're operating in and that we're speaking about. And it's important to understand how race-related injustices are being perpetuated and how we may have a role in the perpetuation of those injustices. And then again, equally as important, it's important to talk about what professionals from across sectors can do to change things. So with that said, with me today, I have 2 dynamic leaders, again, who bring just a wealth of knowledge, experience from a variety of spaces, and specifically in the development space over the decades. So first I have Fadzi Whande, who leads the diversity and inclusion work for the UN's Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. And I have Indira Ahluwalia, who is a strategic advisor to many international development leaders and agencies and is the founder of KAUR Strategies. Thank you, Indira, and thank you, Fadzi, for joining us today. So as we transition into the conversation, the slide that you see now will not remain, but I do invite you to interact with us on social media. You see our LinkedIn, you see our Twitter handles, both our individual and our organizational handles. And then my email address is there as well if you'd like to further the conversation in any way. I'm happy to do that. Also on the bottom of your screen, you should see the Q&A function. So if there's anything that we speak about that you have a comment about or reflection on or have a question about for any of our speakers, please do drop that in the Q&A function. And I'll be sure to integrate that throughout the conversation. And if we're not able to get it throughout the conversation, there will be a designated period at the end where we'll field questions from all of you in the audience. So with that said, I will stop sharing my screen and we will go ahead and get started. So the timing of today's conversation is very interesting. We're coming off the heels of the International Day of the Remembrance of the Slave Trade and its Abolition. That's a mouthful, I need to read it, which was just on August 23rd. And we know that the UN Office of Human Rights recently published a report, and I believe you'll be able to find that report in your chat as well, but recently published a report that focuses on the promotion and the protection of the human rights and fundamental freedoms of Africans and people of African descent. So, and for us at PYXERA Global, the timing of these conversations, it's always right. We're always reflecting, we're always really examining ourselves, the work that we do, how we show up in the world, and ensuring that we're remaining true to our mission. So conversations like this are always on time. So in reflecting on our work and the evolution of our organization, we have to acknowledge that we do have roots in what some would consider the international development space. So this conversation is an additional learning for us as we are on our journey toward becoming truly an anti-racist organization. So Fadzi and Indira, I think it would be helpful for us to level set a bit and explicitly name what we're speaking about when we say international development. Now, I know many people are familiar with the term, heard the term, and probably use the term very often, but I want to make sure that we're all on the same page and coming from the same context when we speak about this space. I'm sure many people probably think about the Millennium Development Goals, which were once a long time ago, and now recently, or currently, I should say, the Sustainable Development Goals, and probably even agencies such as USAID and Oxfam and so on. So I'm sure many of us are familiar with, with these terms and these agencies. So again, I think it's helpful for us to provide context. So from PYXERA Global's perspective, and those of you who are familiar with us on the call, you probably know that we say that we do development differently, meaning in the traditional sense, the connotation of development is that one body, whether that be a government, an organization, a culture, is doing something to another body, another organization, another culture, or doing something for someone else. So for instance, commonly referenced is, parts of the Western world are helping parts of the continent of Africa. Other countries from the Western world are helping or empowering or giving to or developing countries in Africa. And so I want to emphasize the concept of helping or giving to. Whereas at PYXERA Global, we believe in partnership. We believe in collaboration. We believe in standing on strengths, meaning that we do things with one another and together. So for us, inherent in the traditional development mindset is that need deficit model. One group needs another group. One group doesn't have all the answers or the solutions and needs someone else to come in and save them or help them or develop them. And so for us, again, we believe that no one group has all of the answers, no one body, no one government, no one sector has all of the answers or even the right answers. But there is an opportunity to work together to surface what strengths, what resources that each party, each perspective, each group brings to the equation to improve outcomes for all of us, not one or the other, but for all of us, very simply stated. So with that said, Fadzi, I'd like to turn to you first. Would love to hear your general perspective of the international development space. How do you describe it? What has shaped your view of it? And is it bad? And then if you could share how you feel, your perspective on the term international development, even that would be helpful as well. And then Indira, I invite you to jump in right after Fadzi. Thank you. So Fadzi, welcome. I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Renee. I think, one of the things that is important is for us to understand that, definitions and language is really important. In the space that I work in diversity and inclusion, which is very linked to international development, I think, the sense of, are we coming from a shared understanding of what we're actually talking about is really important, because I feel like some of our language has been very, very exclusive, and it hasn't included everyone. And so one of the things that immediately came to mind in talking about this, is, just thinking even about, how diversity and inclusion are used interchangeably. But if we think about, the narratives that form part of dominant group narratives, or, the groups that have most of the social, political, and economic, I suppose, power or access, if we think about international development, it begs the question of developed and developing countries, even that language of, what constitutes a developed country. And when we're talking about, international development, when we're then talking about aid, there's this notion that there's already an imbalance, so, the standard that we're using to measure is obviously different. And if we think about it from a more an inclusive kind of environment, we have to be very conscious about how sometimes our language, when we're thinking that we're doing the right thing, not everyone is coming from, from that shared understanding. Not everyone is coming from that, shared belief, because, when we historically, if we think about, the countries that have been receiving aid or international development, these are countries where, for whatever reason, whether it's poverty or famine or whatever, and then, people respond to that. And I think that, this concept of the white savior mentality was birthed out of that, in the sense that, we know better, we've got something, and, we're now bringing it, across to you. And I think that, this takes away from, systems that were already formed. And, Australia, where I spent a lot of time in, the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander culture groups had a very sophisticated way in which they communicated, in which they ran things, and their culture was very sophisticated. And we see that even, with ancient Egyptian culture, right? And so I think that when we are, coming into specific countries or even language, we have to be very specific as to what we mean. And we also have to be careful that the terminology that we use is not from a place of bias, is not from a place of superiority.
Yep. Thank you, Fadzi. Indira?
Yeah, no, I think Fadzi always makes me think. I really appreciate this opportunity to be part of this group, and PYXERA for always pioneering thought and questioning the paradigm that we work in, because I think it's only then that we get to what we're really supposed to accomplish rather than what we're comfortable doing. I think to the point about language, language is how we justify our bias. And we do it in a way that allows us to get comfortable. So we make it so that we demonstrate the outcome we're seeking without necessarily changing our input through the language. And so, let's get to who I am, so you'll know where I'm coming from and what my agenda is. I'm an Indian Sikh American. I am 53 very recently. I have come from being part of a brown elite in development. And I've come from a place where being brown has meant being sophisticated, being educated, being multidimensional, being able to create my own destiny. Coming from that perspective of being a brown elite, I have understood privilege. And when I look at development from being a person who grew up in India, in Calcutta, the city of joy, where certainly you look at development at a very raw level because you see it in your mind as poverty. You don't see necessarily see it as the intellectual capital or the arts capital. I look at it from that perspective of development where I have sat from a perspective of privilege and education and sophistication in a country which threw Coca-Cola out in the late 70s so we could make our own Coke. I see development then as transactional. I don't see it as altruistic. I see it from a developed, if I can use a terminology that is currently being used, from a Western paradigm as setting up markets, protecting our borders, building our security, ensuring our health. Even when the Marshall Plan came about, it didn't come about to say we are here to help other people's destinies. It came about so we could improve our trade. Today, as I look at it from a global South perspective, or in the terminology that we're more comfortable using even today, the developing country, so that allows that inequity in our behaviors. I look at it and say there's a savviness with how the elite and the privileged are using the income that is coming, or the revenue that is being generated from a development perspective. I also step back and say, I'm not against the concept of development. The idea that two countries can work together to improve outcomes that benefit both. The idea of development as a new systemic model needs to evolve, rather than from the perspective of it being helping. And I think just as I close out this thought, we're used to in the US of the Peace Corps model of development as well. That's a wonderful service initiative, but it's also going into countries as very young people, working with village elders to teach them to make latrines. I suspect they know a lot of what we think we need to teach. I also suspect that people in the global South have their own values and their own self-determination they want to control. And how we in development per se create partnerships, to use PYXERA Global's term, to ensure that we're not modeling, we're not just trading in creating our values becoming global values. And we're not there just to control the assets of another community or a country, but in how we listen and how we hear what the solution is that can keep our borders safe, but also help their destiny.
Thank you, Indira. Thank you both for those remarks. I think we could probably take this conversation in so many different directions. And as we all agree, it's very difficult to have this weighty of a conversation in such a short amount of time. So we do hope that we can just at least scratch the surface. And this is the start of a dialogue, the start of several conversations that we'd love to continue. Indira, I want to kind of pull the thread on something that you had mentioned, and that was around savviness. The savviness of how the elite is using the income from the development space. I know a lot of folks might not want to look at development as a business, or as there is someone who's capitalizing, or there is gain from development. So I want to come back to that. Can you share a little bit more about what you mean when you say understand the savviness that comes along with that, and then how is development really a business? That's something that's not often discussed.
No, absolutely. I think that's a fair point. I mean, even if you look at it from our own perspective, in how we build our budget, we set up earmarks, or we set aside money that has to support a particular segment or a particular sector. We also set aside money based on countries we want to isolate or countries we want to further. We set aside it from the perspective of always, as we should, it's our money, it's our investment, right? To further our foreign policy objectives, to have a return on our investment. If we accept that basic premise that development is investing in a sector or in a people, the return has to be what is of value to us. The other side of it is, other governments are no less savvy than ours. They have the same interests as we do, and they also have the same desire to further their own self-interest. So as the earmarks are set up from our side, the earmarks per se are set up on how the funds are going to be applied. It also is who's in power, how have we cultivated political economies to ensure that it goes beyond that small cohort that will decide who gets the funding in what way. The application is certainly on a from an elite perspective. It comes to people with privilege, and it usually supports those who have raised their hand or been the squeaky wheel, raised their hand from a perspective of privilege, but or been the squeaky wheel. The aspect that I think is important to recognize is how do we actually ensure that the transaction benefits. I always look at a 51-49% paradigm in this investment. We maintain control, but for the full return on our investment, and with the recognition of the savvy with which our money can be used locally, with the boundaries we want to protect, how do we engage in that dialogue? Especially given where we are currently in the development paradigm, where we want to hear local voices, or we want to empower local voices. I don't think we're at a point where we want to share power. That would go towards decolonizing development. But we're certainly at a point where we want to hear. So how are we hearing the savvy and protecting the interests of civil society as much as our own interests?
Thank you for that. I want to pull a thread on something else you said. So you said a complete shift would mean decolonizing development. Not sure that we want to do that. Can you say more? Why wouldn't we want to decolonize development?
You know, when we decolonize development, ultimately we're looking at sharing power. We're also looking at accepting responsibility in a way we haven't. In accepting responsibility, we have to take personal accountability. We have to evaluate where we have taken advantage of our own privileges. And I have to say that I've always believed people are good. And I have also believed that people are well-intentioned. The challenge with well-intentioned people is sometimes it stops there. Mm-hmm. So where I say we want to be careful about how far we want to take it is by looking at systems and how we decolonize development, not necessarily in the intention of doing it, which is where I say we're not quite there yet. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm,
mm-hmm. Understood. Completely with you on the acceptance piece and kind of on the personal behaviors piece. I did have another question, but Fadzi, did you want to jump in and say something?
Yeah, I did, particularly around, just the impact of, intention and, the difference between intent and impact. And, it's said that we often judge ourselves on our intentions, but we judge others on an impact. And I think that as a sector and as a space, it's actually time for the international development sector to start looking and judging themselves on the impact of some of these programs, right? Some of the projects and some of the things that they're doing, because, when we think about, the intentions and, well-intended, good intentions, all of these, sometimes they have a very negative impact on people. And when we think about that from a equity and diversity and inclusion lens, it's about actually recognizing that, the groups of people that where there might be an underrepresentation or are facing historical challenges, it's also understanding where they are. Because I think that when we go into specific spaces, with this mindset that we are here to teach or we are here to show you a better way, already there's an imbalance. Already that is not an equitable approach. And that to me is showing, an exclusion in a way. And I think that one of the things that is missing, even when we talk about, the diversity and inclusion agenda as a whole, in terms of, and I say diversity and inclusion because it is the framework and the foundation in any sector. So, as far as I'm concerned, even if we're looking at international development, it should be from the lens of, how can I create a more inclusive program, project, or even organization? And I think that we have to be mindful that we are also on a journey of learning, and that we can learn from each and every, situation in terms of that. And I liken this to, when we're talking about, dismantling some of these, things that, particularly if we look at the events of the last 18 months, of which every sector you went under the microscope in terms of, the intentions and what they're set out to do, following, George Floyd's death, COVID, all of these things had a huge impact on any sector that we're working in. But one of the things that, people asked me and said, why do you think, this has come about? Why do you think we're having these conversations? Why do you think diversity, inclusion, racism in every sector, everyone is putting a spotlight? And I said, to be quite honest, is because white allies are speaking up. Because up until that point, we've been talking about this for a long time. And I think that as a sector, there may be things that have been talked about in international development for years, but there's something about when, the people who are part of this dominant culture narrative actually start to see that there's something wrong and calling it out, we then start to see there's a change in conversation. And I think it's about examining ourselves and asking ourselves, are we having the right conversations? Are we prepared to feel uncomfortable in having those conversations? Because I think the journey of, dismantling some of these things really needs to start with us individually to say, you know what, I can learn through this process. I can be better. And I think it's that saying about, we don't want people in the international development space just to do good. We want them to do better. And doing better means examining and improving and also learning and being able to sit in what I call discomfort, just sit in it, see what comes up for you, and then you can move on from there.
I really, go ahead.
Go ahead. No, go
I really
ahead.
appreciate that the discussion we're having is personal right now. I mean, I think that it has to start within ourselves. And, as we were saying, being well-intentioned sometimes just lets you off the hook.
Yeah.
You could have said it right once, and then you could think, I'm done. It's the practice of your intention in development, because we are on a day-to-day basis, whether on Zoom, in our offices, or in other countries, we have the opportunity to offend or respect. And if we are not aware of our own biases, if we're not aware of our own discomforts and how we're protecting ourselves, we're not going to be able to truly respect the other. I have to say about the point on allyship, I'm sorry, Renay, you've got me going now.
That's okay.
I have always been uncomfortable with the term ally, because I feel if I'm an ally, I can watch from the sideline. I don't have to get in and get my hands really dirty and fight. I want to fight because I believe in equality, and I want to act because I believe in equality. And I want to be accountable because I take responsibility for being a leader.
So what would you say, Indira, to that point? Instead of an ally, I've heard accomplice, a co-conspirator. Would you call it anything?
I would say I'm an actor.
An actor.
Yeah, I will never have the lived experience you have. You will never have the lived experience I have.
Right.
However, I can believe your lived experience is real. And you can give me the same respect.
Right.
And the beauty of equality is very different from equity, is that I can give you the respect and I could ask for the respect of being equal. When we start getting to equity, then we can get the system. But at the core of it, I've got to believe you know things that are so unique and so important that I need to learn from you. And I have to have the same confidence. And my enabling environment has to give me that confidence that I can speak to you about what I bring without fear. And unless we're doing that in development, in the village, in a host government's office, we're talking to ourselves.
Right. Thank you for that. There's about 5 points that I want to come back to. I was jotting things down as you both were speaking. Power, how biases are manifested, actually measuring impact. We started to talk a little bit about, intent versus impact. How do you actually measure and quantify impact, and then behaviors? Before we do that though, Fadzi, I want to turn to you specifically thinking about the work that you do within the United Nations. When we talk about development, global development and international development, the mind automatically goes to ethnicity and culture or nationality. Very rarely, at least in the conversations that I'm in, is race a part of that. And so since the purpose of our time today is really to examine how racism shows up in what we're talking about and in the work that we do, I'd love to hear kind of how you manage or tackle this conundrum within the United Nations context and in the work that you do specific to race. And Indira, something you had mentioned reminded me of this when you started talking about being a privileged brown person. We don't often think about that when we think about, development and working in other countries. We kind of lump everyone together in the bucket of everyone needs to be seen or everyone needs help, but not thinking about the dynamics and the layers and the levels and the castes that, do exist in different geographies and countries. So Fadzi, would love to hear how are you handling this within the UN?
I think, historically, from our office, we tend to collect data on, nationality. Pretty much, I guess, whatever's on the passport page is what we collect data on. And of course, if we think about, the UN and, the member states and governments, a lot of it is based on nationality. Making sure we have equitable geographic diversity. I think a challenge with, some of that is the fact that in terms of if I think about the system in the UN system, I'm Australian, so my nationality is Australian. So the experiences of Fadzi as a Black woman and the ethnicity that I carry currently, because we're not collecting that information, becomes a challenge, particularly if we're thinking about everything that's transpired in the last 18 months, where, there's a real focus on racism within a variety of sectors. And I feel like you've got to give people an opportunity to self-identify, to be able to identify their race if we're tackling racism, because, even that terminology, there's a big difference between race and racism, two totally different things. And so oftentimes when people are talking about race, they actually think it's racism. And when you ask people, what is your racial makeup? Or if I refer to you, Renay, as a Black woman, there's some people who say, oh my God, you said Black, that's so racist. No, it isn't, because I'm talking about race. I'm not talking about the experiences or negative experiences as well. So I think that's one of the biggest challenges, is that we don't actually know the difference between talking about race and racism. And yes, there is no scientific evidence to justify the existence of race, but we all know that it is a social and political construct. And so, that narrative is very much true and has been for so long, and it impacts in every single country, whether we're talking about, the impact of colonization, America and the civil era in terms of, where even the language in terms of, the Declaration of Independence, we hold these truths to be self-evident. All men are created equal. Are they? Are they really? And then we look at, apartheid, white Australia policy in Australia. So we can see how the social and political structures have created this monster. And because of that, we're now in the impact of that. And so I think that when we get the language right, that will be the start. And then we have to give people the opportunity to be able to self-identify, knowing that it impacts. So we can't just say, well, it doesn't exist. We've got one, it's just about the human race. Absolutely. And biology tells us it doesn't exist. However, socially, politically, economically, it does exist. And we see this even in the mandate of international development. Why can't we be developing the so-called developed countries, with our culture and all of that, and we've got this, what I call romantic multiculturalism, where we have a romance with certain cultures when it comes to food and language. And so when we go into these countries and you hear people talking, oh, the people of Africa, their costumes are so bright and, they're always happy despite the challenges. Maybe that's not a challenge to them, so I think it's all about the language and this perception, that people have. So it is an issue within our system in terms of, collection of data. And I bring that up because, to try and win people over, I find that it's easier when you have robust data. And unfortunately, we actually don't collect enough data when it comes to race, ethnicity across the board. So in any particular organization, one of the things I constantly hear is, oh, we don't collect data. So we're doing it with gender and all, but we're not collecting that. And I think it's because we have never been taught how to talk about race. Race has never been at the forefront of any discussion. We've always been taught to keep quiet about it, don't bring it up, don't rock the boat. And a quick example I'll give you is, at a cafe, I was in line waiting for my coffee, and in front of me, there's a lady with her young daughter. She must have been about 2 or 3. And she's staring at me as some toddlers often do. And she whispers loudly and says, "Mommy, she's got chocolate skin." And her mom slapped her hand and said, "Shh, you can't say that, that's rude." And I just saw her sheepishly look at me and sort of, and for me, I was thinking, what has that taught that little girl about me? What has basically happened is she's going to grow up knowing you can't talk about race, it is a bad thing. And women with chocolate skin, I can't say anything about it. And so I think that is the start of how we are not talking about, certain things because we don't have the language. And now we have an issue where people who are Black or brown are saying, we want to be seen. It's no longer okay to get away with, but I don't see color. Well, you better,
Yeah,
because it's right here in front of you. And I don't have a problem with you seeing color, Where is this misconception that it's wrong to see color? It's because we don't know how to talk about race.
Right.
That's the problem.
To that point, thank you for that, Fadzi. And I have a shared experience too. When I lived in Japan, the children would come up to me and touch my skin and say, "Oh, it's sweet like chocolate." And they would want to lick my skin. I did not let them lick my skin, but we had a conversation about it. So hopefully that informed how they now view race. But you bring up some really interesting points. I know when you first shared with me that the UN does not collect data on race, my mind was blown. I would have never in a million years thought that to be the case. So I'm happy to hear that we're starting, that there is a start for that to start to be captured. But then it also begs the question of how racism is manifested, in development or in the work that the UN does or the different agencies does that we're not even aware of because we're not capturing or measuring certain things in certain ways. So want to transition the conversation to how racism is manifested in development. We have a lot of PYXERA Global, we work with a great deal of corporations and private sector leaders. And so in the work that we do, some of the work does show up in a development type way. So one of the things that we do when we work with corporate employees is there's a period of kind of training and education, what we call pre-work. So one of the things that we want to make sure that we surface is, how does racism in this world manifest? If you see it, how do you know? What are you looking for? How do you know that you're not participating in it? If you are participating in it unknowingly, how do you correct? So transitioning into manifestations, what it looks like, and then back to behaviors. What's our responsibility, you know, as individuals to check our behaviors, be aware of our behaviors, and then behave differently. And so I'll ask both of you to address that, please.
I would say in terms of manifestation, I think we have to realize that, you know, there's 3 or 4 more main ways in which I see racism manifest. So, you know, the organizational and institutional, that systemic racism, where we can pretty much, you know, ask ourselves, you know, why is there racism? Why is there a high percentage of Aboriginal, Torres Strait Islander youth or African-American men in the prison system? You know, why do we see these health disparities in education and in health? And so there's a systemic way in which there's a separation, and you see it at play there. And then there's also the, you know, the interpersonal, which is what we're most familiar with. This is the, you know, I don't like you because you're this, you know, this is where we see a lot of it. We see the recordings and all. That's interpersonal, you know, that's a white versus black or brown kind of, you know. And then there's the internal, you know, as a Black person, you know, the notion that I can subscribe to the dominant narrative of what people think about people of my race. So internalized whiteness, some people will call it. So, you know, it can manifest in so many different ways in that way. And I think that the mistake that we often make is trying to deal with something at a systemic level when it's at an interpersonal level, or dismissing the interpersonal racism, you know, the individual acts that are the most common, and saying it's a structural thing. No, it's about you changing your attitude, your perspectives, your bias, and your behavior. And this is another thing that I'll say, you know, we're talking about language, is diversity is about difference. It's about, you know, the different things, and race is just one aspect, so is gender. But inclusion is about our attitude, it is about our behavior, it is about those perceptions. And so when we're challenging that, we have to realize it takes time. It is a journey, it is not a sprint. We're not going to be able to measure that, you know, straight away. We can measure diversity because we can use data, we can have targets. Inclusion is now about culture, it's about how we see things. And I think that's where a lot of the times we try and tackle the different aspects of racism with the wrong approach.
No, absolutely. I think just to kind of go back for a second on a question you'd also asked Renay about the brown elite per se. And, you know, I want to ask our participants, when they think about development and they think about images in development, what are the first 2 or 3 images that come to your mind? You know, I have seen so many women in saris in development. Smiling brown women in saris sometimes represents development. Sometimes it is hungry, destitute, naked children. Sometimes it's poverty in terms of how you see it in the images of the dilapidated villages. You see it after a hurricane has leveled the place. Nowhere do we see the Oxford educated or the local state educated or the people at a dressed as we dress in other countries. We have always found a way to other and belittle others by how we have been taught to see it. We've been programmed by the same images. So I think it's intentional in how I call out being a brown elite, not because I'm proud of being privileged, but because I want to demonstrate there are different images we need to have when we think about other people. I have to say that I started in development in the late 80s, and my father, as a Sikh man, a brown man with a turban, would walk into USAID and would really get questioned about his access to the building, to this space. So I think that gave him, as a brown man who was ambitious about owning his own business, doing work in development, more power, because it wasn't that he had to prove himself, it was that he had to do something. So I think the onus sometimes becomes on us who are different to prove our worth. And that's got to be part of the dialogue as we go from an ethnocentric, white-centered approach to development. I think that you can do metrics in a way that is very simple. If you look at your own organization today, think about, even in the old days, when you walk into the boardroom for a meeting, who sits where? Who sits at the head of the table? Who sits at the table? Who just quietly, without even trying, knows they have to sit outside the table? Whose voice is outside the room? Whose voice is outside your office? What voices are you hearing to make decisions that impact that whole ecosystem? Look at who works where. Where are the brown and Black people working? Are they working at administrative positions? Are they working in decision-making positions? Where are the locals working? The 30-year veteran who is still doing accounting that a young person fresh out of college is checking their invoices for numbers. So think about these very simple metrics, but also think about it from the perspective of salaries. Who's getting paid what? Think about it in terms of who's on your board. You know, don't do part. I have to say, I also don't love inclusion, Fadzi. Inclusion opens up the door for participation. It doesn't guarantee decision making. It doesn't guarantee ownership. So to me, it's a simple mat that somebody puts out at their front door to say, you can come in, but we'll let you know where you can sit. So to me, the ultimate metric is in who makes the decision and how are the surveys that we're doing. All of us are very good at collecting the data about how we're doing as an organization, but we've got to look at the questions. Are we asking the right questions? Are we creating the environment where people are not afraid to say, I don't feel like I am safe to raise my voice and tell you how I really feel? And if that's happening in your organization, you are not getting the return on your investment of paying that person a full salary because they're operating at a suboptimal level because they haven't been given a sense of ownership. And so they cannot perform at the highest productivity. But I think in terms of a very specific initiative, certainly we're in this moment where we're all talking about race and equity. We're also recognizing that it's the BIPOC folks who are raising their voices more. We're also recognizing that the money that is supposed to go to this moment has been obligated, but is not being spent. So we've got to be very quantitative about where we take our intentions. And one initiative I started earlier this year is the Task Force on Racial and Ethnic Equity and International Development. We've been talking about it. We've been talking about it for a number of years that we've got to build equity. We're at also a very 101 stage where we don't even have an understanding of what that means and what that would look like in application. So I was fortunate enough to be able to bring together leaders from for-profit, non-profit companies that are organizations that are working in international development and take on a slice of this fight for equity. And the slice really is looking at where we have manageable control. In bringing the leaders together, the leaders know they control their staffing, they control their culture, they have an ability to demonstrate their accountability. And so this task force has been working on creating a pledge which specifically focuses on racial and ethnic equity. It's very intentionally not focusing on gender equity. And to be completely frank, the gender equity we've been doing in international development or even in the United States has really been about equity with white women. It hasn't always included women of other ethnicities and from a racial perspective. So we've been very intentional in saying this is about race and this is about ethnicity. And we've got 5 components we're developing. They include creating a policy. And I have to say that racial and ethnic equity is very different from diversity, because it's that slice we're calling out that needs attention. It doesn't take away from the framework of everybody being equal, but this is where this pledge can focus. And as we focus on it, we're looking at 5 components, as I say, the policy and systems, so that there's a policy that people, organizations sign on to say that they are going to apply this lens of racial and ethnic equity across all their policies and systems. We're looking then specifically at people, composition, leadership, and organizational structure, how it impacts parity, organizational culture, because the psychological safety for people to feel they belong and therefore can act in the full interest of their ambitions and the companies has huge dividends for the company or the organization. Accountability, implementation, measurements, and reporting. And finally, communications. The idea that leaders can call it, can own it. You know, it's the microaggressions that we have to stop, from being a chocolate skinned person or being a Sikh person with a turban, or somebody asking me, how's the weather in India? You know, these are microaggressions that the leaders have to recognize in themselves and curb.
Thank you so much for that, Indira. And I think from PYXERA Global's perspective, we are excited to be partnering with you in the task force and kind of upholding some of the commitments as well. Thank you for sharing that, and great transition. I am very mindful of time. We do have some questions that come in, so I want to make sure that we do ask some of the questions that came in from the audience. But before doing that, want to transition in more into the actions. So you open the door, Indira, for kind of the actions, the so what, the accountabilities, the commitments. Fadzi, want to hear from you. And I noticed in the UN report that we had mentioned earlier, there actually is a clause around corporate accountability and kind of corporate engagement in moving the needle toward dismantling structural racism in development, or in this space. What does that look like? What does that mean? So for our corporate partners who are on the phone, they often say, we want to do something, we don't know what to do. So from your perspective, what does that look like? What do they actually do? And then equally importantly, if you ask me, I say more importantly, is how do we hold them accountable? How do they hold themselves accountable to those commitments and to those actions? And then I do want to make sure that we have time for at least 2 questions from the audience. But go ahead, Fadzi.
I think one of the things that's important to highlight is what gets measured gets done, the stuff that you actually measure. And I think as a corporate organization, I think the first thing is to actually acknowledge that there's a problem. A lot of the times we tend to run away from the fact that the problem exists. And I think that that's what we have to do. We have to acknowledge it. And then, in terms of, where we can, I think accountability is so important, but I think that committing to the process of rectifying the situation is equally as important. So understanding that this work is going to take time. I think for some of them, like for example, within our entity, recognizing that something needed to be done was by making sure that they had a position to look specifically at this, put resources to it, because, talking about it and saying, what can we do, put resources, to that. And I would also say, hear from the people that this is impacting, because a lot of the times we come up with this, but, where are the local, people in the organizations that you're working with? I think it's also important to hear from them. But I think part of that commitment is being a visible champion, and you can be a visible champion by ensuring that this is an agenda item. This is about a continuous journey of learning. This is about reaching out to those who might know more, but it's also about, understanding that You know, for me, cultural intelligence is so key in this, because a lot of people think, yeah, we're a global organization, and, you know, international development organizations are very global because you're working across divides. And so how much of the cultural aspects and nuances do you actually understand? And what role do the local players, you know, have in terms of setting the tone? In terms of racial, the dismantling this, you have to acknowledge it exists. Just because there's no scientific evidence and there's a dismissal of people's experiences, I always say it's the ABC. So I'll leave them with that, the ABC. First of all, you work on your attitude. You know, what's your attitude going into a situation? What's your attitude about, you know, dismantling racism, because that needs work. B, it's about the behavior. I think Indira touched on this before, by, you know, the burden of educating the majority is always on the minority. We need to change that. We need to have what I call active allies. You know, you call them actors. I'm talking active allies. And I always say an active ally is built for change, in terms of not just about, I want a quick fix, but you're there for change. You're there until that change happens. You're built for change, not speed. You know, it's not about the quick actions. And I think the C for me is about the compassion. I mean, we all want a sense and feel and need a sense of belonging. Each and every one of us, we need that. So you've got to have those ABCs, work on your attitude, change your behavior, and have some compassion, I think. And a lot of that, if you look at the report, or even look at the UN, leave no one behind in terms of our sustainable development, you might get some things from that.
Thank you, Fadzi. Really quickly, we have about 2 minutes left, so I'm just going to dive right into one of the questions that came in from the audience is, donor-funded institutions are increasingly focused on ecosystem development, particularly to encourage social enterprises. Do you see a different dynamic with expats raising money for social enterprises?
It's the same paradigm, right? It's still an uneven sense in my mind of the purpose. And it's from that perspective, if it goes back to the altruism and helping the organization look good. There might be positive intent, but it's in how you build, I will use the word inclusion now, in how the decision, of that social enterprise is in having that reform happen. So it's not a reform we're putting on other people. It's a reform that is navigated together.
Excellent, thank you. And I'm going to slide in one more question that we got in from the audience. I'm interested to get both of your opinions on the local actors in the diaspora working with the international development and their role responsibility in affecting or directing the intention and impact. They understand the local culture. Do you think they should also take ownership in steering or can steer the intention and impact? So Fadzi, that's to your point of kind of the inclusion, if you will, of the community where we're working. Their voice should be louder than any other, coming from the outside. So any thoughts, any kind of closing thoughts on that inclusive community piece?
I think it's definitely important. I think they are the ones that need to have the loudest voice. It's been said, if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. I think we carve them out too much and have them for dinner. I think there should be really driving the agenda going forward. So they absolutely have a key role in shaping, in also leading the charge. And I think that the responsibility is on organizations to incorporate that within the decision making. Absolutely.
I think it's just to close on that for one second, I think there is an incentive for the organizations to incorporate the voices because the results are so much more meaningful and impactful.
Thank you. Indira, Fadzi, thank you for your time. Thank you for sharing your perspectives, your experiences, and giving us a ton to think about. For those who were able to stay with us through the end here in the audience, thank you for sticking with us. I'll send out a recording as well as a summary of the conversation. There were a ton of questions that we weren't able to get to, so I actually will turn those into an article to have just some Q&A to make sure that we're all sharing information and able to benefit from the dynamic conversation as well. So this is just the beginning. Stay tuned. Thank you each for your time, and I look forward to seeing you on the next iteration of our series. Thank you so much
for having us.
Thank you for the honor.
Thank you.